Throughout the centuries, there have been many brutal and barbaric men and women who ruled over nations and countries and made their people suffer. This included dictators and their wives. Some met their bloody ends in execution and revolution, but also kings and queens were known for sometimes being tyrants. Some even executed large amounts of their own people and plunged their nation into civil wars, which were very costly. But some of these rulers, in the centuries and years after their deaths, have had their remains disturbed and their coffins opened for various reasons. Some have had their remains disinterred to bring shame upon them, and others have had their body dug up to prove they were actually dead. In this video documentary, we look at some of the most brutal leaders in history and see what was found when their coffins were opened. And to support this channel, please make sure to subscribe. After his crushing defeat at the Battle of Waterloo in the June of 1815, Napoleon surrendered to the British, hoping perhaps to live quietly in England. Instead, the British government decided to remove him as a threat once and for all, and they sent him to St. Helena, a volcanic island in the South Atlantic Ocean, nearly 1,200 miles from the coast of Africa, and even farther from Europe. St. Helena was a bleak and isolated place. The British authorities, led by Governor Sir Hudson Lowe, made sure Napoleon could never escape. His residence, Longwood House, was damp, windswept and far from comfortable. Although he was allowed a small group of loyal followers, including generals and servants, he lived under constant supervision, with his movements restricted, and for 6 years, from 1815 to 1821, Napoleon lived in this enforced exile. He spent his days dictating his memoirs, walking in the garden, and reflecting on his extraordinary career. But as the years passed, his health began to fail. By 1817, Napoleon started complaining of stomach pains, fatigue, and nausea. His once robust figure grew heavier, and he often appeared weak. Observers noted that he became less active, preferring to stay indoors, and Napoleon himself feared that he might be suffering from the same illness that killed his father, Carlo Bonaparte, who died at 39 from what was thought to be stomach cancer. The emperor suspected this hereditary weakness, and his fears were only reinforced as his symptoms worsened. His doctor on St. Helena debated his condition. Some believed it was stomach cancer, others thought it was a stomach ulcer or liver disease, and medical care on the island was limited, and disagreements among the doctors often led to confusion rather than effective treatment. By 1820, Napoleon's health had taken a sharp decline. He was often bedridden, unable to take long walks, and suffered from swelling in his legs and abdomen. He lost his appetite, and his once commanding voice grew weaker. In early 1821, it became clear Napoleon was dying. He spent much of his time lying on sofa or bed, too weak to do much else. His companions, including General Bertrand and Count Montholon, remained by his side, recording his words and caring for him. Despite his suffering, Napoleon remained mentally sharp, often dictating notes and giving instructions about how he wanted his story told to future generations. On May 3, 1821, Napoleon's condition became critical. He drifted in and out of consciousness, murmuring about France, his army, and his son, the Duke of Reichstadt, who was living in Austria. On May 5th, a violent storm lashed the island, and Napoleon lay unconscious in Longwood House, attended by his companions and doctors. At 5:49 in the evening, he breathed his last. He was 51 years old, and his final recorded words were, "France, armée, tête d'armée, Josephine." France, army, head of the army, Josephine. Whether these exact words were spoken or shaped later by those around him is uncertain, but they reflect the main themes of his life: his country, his soldiers, his first wife, Josephine de Beauharnais, who had died years before. The day after his death, an autopsy was carried out by his doctors, including the British physician Francesco Antomarchi, They reported that Napoleon's stomach was in a dreadful state, with a large ulcer which appeared to be cancer. This seemed to confirm Napoleon's own fears of hereditary illness. However, not everyone agreed. In the decades that followed, alternative theories arose. Some argued that Napoleon had been poisoned, possibly with arsenic, either by his British captors or by one of his companions. Supporters of this theory point to the presence of arsenic in hair samples said to belong to him. Others argue that arsenic was commonly found in wallpaper dyes and medicines of the time, and that the slow poisoning was unlikely. Most modern historians and doctors now believe Napoleon did indeed die of stomach cancer, worsened by the poor living conditions on St. Helena. Napoleon's body was dressed in his favourite uniform, a green coat with the chasseurs of the Imperial Guard, white breeches and boots. On his chest rested the Légion d'honneur medal. He was buried on May 9, 1821, in a valley near Longwood House. The site was chosen by Napoleon himself, shaded by willow trees and far from the sea winds. The British buried him without his name on the tombstone, simply inscribing a "Here lies," a deliberate decision, as they feared his grave might become a shrine for Bonapartists. Napoleon's remains did not stay in St. Helena's forever. In 1840, nearly 2 decades after his death, King Louis-Philippe of France arranged for his body to be brought back to Paris, known as the Retour des Cendres, Return of the Ashes. This event was accompanied by grand ceremonies, and on the 15th of October 1840, the grave of Napoleon was opened in the presence of French and British witnesses. Many had seen the original interment. With a huge amount of force, 2 layers of cement were broken, the giant stone slab was lifted up, and the outer mahogany coffin appeared to be intact and only had slight traces of the effects of humidity and dampness. There were 2 holes drilled into the coffin to allow any possible gases to escape, in the hope the body would not have exploded. The casket was brought out of the tomb, and inside there was a lead coffin which contained the body. The outer wooden coffin was not nailed and was resting, and when the lead coffin was opened, it was remarkable what was discovered. The body of Napoleon appeared to be intact, and it was in an unbelievable state of conservation, and was quite clear Napoleon was inside. There were around 3 or 4 minutes of Napoleon's body. His skin appeared very white. His body was confirmed to have been well preserved. His hat was placed across his legs, and a silver vase crowned with an imperial eagle contained his heart, and this was found near to the body. After this, the body of Napoleon was lifted from the coffin and transferred to an elaborate sarcophagus, which was then leaded onto a specifically constructed and ornamented hearse to be repatriated back to France. On December 15, 1840, Napoleon's coffin was placed in a magnificent tomb in Les Invalides, Paris, the French capital which he had once ruled. It became his final resting place, and to this day visitors can see his grand red sarcophagus under the Golden Dome, one of the most visited sites in Paris. Now, Napoleon's death closed the chapter on a man who had dominated European politics for 2 decades. His exile was lonely, and it became a lonely end and was part of the legend, showing the fall of a man who had once crowned himself emperor. To his supporters, he was a tragic hero, a brilliant leader brought low by cruel fate. To his enemies, his death was the fitting end of a tyrant who had caused endless war. But what was found when his coffin was opened was shocking and remarkable. It showed Napoleon's body had been preserved very well, and it had been embalmed with such skill there had been no decay at all. Today Napoleon's remains inside his tomb in Paris, many miles from where he actually died, and people still flock to see the sarcophagus. Nicolae Ceausescu rose throughout the ranks of the Romanian Communist Party, and he served as the head of state from 1965 to 1989. He was someone who is classed today as a dictator, and he was married to his ruthless and power-hungry wife, Elena. Together, the pair tried to craft an image as the mother and father of the nation, but after he came into power, Ceausescu initially became very popular. He tried to restrict the influence of the Soviet Union upon his land, but his government became rather totalitarian, and he would be leading one of the most repressive regimes in Europe. He employed a secret police force to round up and spy upon those who were suspected of dissenting against him, and he also controlled the media and the press. His wife Elena even ensured that she would never be captured in side profile in photographs, as she was concerned about her large nose. Elena was a very vain woman, and Nikolai claimed that when he first met her, he never looked at another woman in a romantic way. There was further repression inside of Romania, and also human rights abuses documented. He also introduced a number of terrible policies that led to many people suffering. Nikolai tried to implement ideas that would lead to a growth in the population, but many women suffered, and there was an increase in children being made orphans. He trashed the Romanian economy too, and his nation became incredibly in debt, and in 1982 he directed the government to export most of the agriculture production, and this led to many people starving, and they couldn't get basic resources, medicine or food. It was a sorry state of affairs, but eventually, like in most nations, the people could only take so much, and an uprising occurred. The Christmas Revolution, as it was known, emerged in Romania in the December of 1989. To begin with, the protests began because of the deportation of an influential preacher, but as the days continued, the original cause of the outrage and uprising was lost, and the people began to call for an end to the Ceausescu's tyranny. They had grown tired of the man and woman at the top of their government. Inside different towns and cities, revolution broke out, and Nicolae Ceausescu left his wife Elena to deal with this, as he went off on a state visit to Iran, but Elena in principle could do very little. Eventually the army and military were ordered to fire on unarmed civilians, and there was a number of deaths. Upon her husband's return, a huge rally was organised in a square in Bucharest, and Nicolae Ceausescu, alongside Elena, lectured the crowd, and he performed a bizarre and disjointed speech. He did not have command over the crowd, and there were gunshots or fireworks heard, and there was then a general panic, but further fighting broke out between the protesters and Ceausescu's army. But at this point, some soldiers and members of the militia were beginning to actually switch in their support from the dictator and his wife to the rebels. They began to refuse to fire at civilians, and they took on the side of the people. At 12:06 on the 22nd of December 1989, the Ceausescus tried to flee the Central Committee building, where they had been holed up. A helicopter arrived to get them out, but they just managed to take off before rebels would storm onto the rooftop. The Ceausescus were feeling like cornered rats, and they could not find somewhere safe to land. Eventually their helicopter was brought down in a town in Targosvite, but it was not long before they were captured by local insurgents and police, and they were then taken to a military barracks where they were taken to trial. This trial occurred on Christmas Day, 1989, and it was clear that the legal proceedings had already been determined. It was obvious that the Ceausescus would be condemned to death, and there was no chance for them to defend themselves. Neither was there any legal counsel given to them. Elena Ceausescu was furious, and she went down kicking and screaming, and she refused to acknowledge the legality of the courtroom, and she thought she was being murdered a martyr. Following the guilty verdict and death sentence being passed, Elena and her husband were then taken out of the courtroom, and they were told to stand by the side of the wall of the military barracks. Nikolai began to sing and whistle in his final moments, but Elena was much more desperate. She screamed at the soldiers, calling them sons of dogs, and she would not settle. She had her arms secured to prevent further struggle, but in quick and efficient fashion, Elena was then faced with her firing squad, a collection of paratroop soldiers. There had been dozens who had been volunteered to shoot the dictator and his wife, but the paratroopers opened up their machine guns incredibly quickly. They shot before the instruction to fire had been given, and the television cameras, which had been set up to capture the grim spectacle, missed half of the gunshots because of how quickly they were shot. After this, their bodies were then packed away inside of a coffin and were taken to the Ghencea cemetery in Bucharest. They were buried with a simple grave, but on different sides of a path that ran through the cemetery in separate plots. They were not, to begin with, buried in the same grave, but it was no secret where the Ceausescus were buried. Communist symbols and many flowers decorated the graves regularly, but as the decades passed, the daughter of Elena and Nikolai asked for the remains to be dug up. She wanted her mother and her father to be buried together in the same plot. It was in the year 2010 that the graves of Nicolae Ceausescu and his wife were opened and disturbed. The reason this occurred and took place was to ensure that the bodies buried inside of these graves actually belonged to the dictator and his wife, as there was some seeds of doubt that had sprung over the years. For this to be confirmed, DNA testing was ordered. The graves were opened and the coffins of the Ceausescus were all opened. Many people witnessed the exhumations from within the cemetery. Pathologist specialists exhumed the bodies inside of the Ceausescu graves and they lifted the corpses. For Elena Ceausescu, there was actually very little left of her, to the point that no DNA could be collected from her remains. Nicolae Ceausescu's remains were in a better state, and it was said that his body was still wearing the black winter coat and the grey fur hat that he was pictured wearing during his execution decades before. He had been buried in these, and DNA was extracted from Ceausescu's body and it was later sent back to the laboratories for testing. Later it was confirmed that the remains inside of Nicolae Ceausescu's grave were in fact his, as a DNA match was confirmed with the Ceausescu's son. With this it's confirmed that the remains inside of the grave were in fact the former dictators, and the doubt was gotten rid of. The bones of Elena were not tested, as not enough DNA was able to be extracted, but with the proximity of the burial to her husband, and with the fact the grave was marked, it was accepted that these remains were in fact Elena's. It isn't known why the bones of the dictator decayed much slower than his wife's. Probably her coffin may have not been sealed as well as her husband's. The burial of the Ceausescus was known to have been rather quick and rapid, and they were thrown inside of graves with no embalming, and little protection to the bodies was given. The DNA of Nicolae Ceausescu was actually confirmed twice, with his brother also giving a sample to confirm it. The bodies of Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu were then buried inside of the same cemetery, in the same grave, and today there are many people who flock to the grave to pay their respects. Their bodies are marked by a tombstone, a small distance from where they were originally laid to rest. The executions of the Ceausescus was ruthless and were brutal, but for many inside of Romania, it started the beginning of a new way of life. The body of Nicolae Ceausescu was in a good state when his coffin was opened, and this allowed scientists to successfully confirm that it was him inside of the grave. Benito Mussolini had ruled Italy since 1922, creating the world's first fascist state. For years, he was admired by some and feared by many. He promised to restore Roman glory, expand Italian territory and modernise the nation. But by the Second World War, Mussolini's ambitions had turned into disaster. Aligning himself with Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany dragged Italy into devastating conflict for which it was unprepared. By 1943, Allied forces had invaded Sicily and were advancing into mainland Italy. Mussolini's own government turned against him. King Victor Emmanuel III dismissed him from power in July of 1943, and Mussolini was briefly imprisoned before being rescued by German commandos in a daring raid. Installed as the puppet leader of German-controlled Italian Social Republic in the north, Mussolini's authority was only a shadow of what it had once been. As Allies advanced further, and German defeat seemed inevitable, Mussolini became increasingly desperate. By late April of 1945, Allied troops and Italian partisans were closing in on the last pockets of German resistance in northern Italy. Mussolini, realising that his time was nearly up, decided to flee. and on April 25, 1945, he left Milan with his mistress, Clara Petacci, and a small group of loyal fascists. Their goal was to reach Switzerland, and from there perhaps escape to Spain. Mussolini disguised himself in a German military uniform and attempted to blend in with the retreating German convoy heading north, but he was no longer the commanding figure he once was. Witnesses from those days described him as physically worn, mentally exhausted, and strangely passive. A man who had once thundered from balconies now seemed broken and resigned. Even as he tried to escape, Mussolini appeared to understand that his life was coming to an end. On April 27, 1945, Mussolini's convoy was stopped by Italian partisans near the village of Dongo, on the shores of Lake Como. The partisans, suspicious of the group, searched the vehicles and soon discovered Mussolini trying to hide under a blanket. His disguise failed to fool them, and the once mighty dictator was recognised and taken prisoner. Clara Petacci, who refused to abandon him, was captured alongside him. The capture caused excitement among the resistance fighters, and for years Mussolini had ruled through violence and fear, and now he was completely at their mercy. Debates broke out among the partisans. Should Mussolini be handed over to the Allies for trial, or should he be executed immediately to prevent any chance of escape or rescue by German troops? In the end, the decision was made by leaders of the National Liberation Committee. Mussolini had to die. On the afternoon of April 28, 1945, Mussolini and Petacci were taken to a small village called Giulingo di Mezzagra. There they were lined up against a stone wall outside of a villa. Walter Aducio, a partisan fighter who went by the nom de guerre Colonel Valerio, was given the task of carrying out the execution. Accounts differ on exactly how the scene unfolded, but the outcome was certain. Mussolini is said to have faced his killers silently, perhaps too drained to resist or plead, and Clara Petacci, only 33 years old, clung to him, crying out in fear and refusing to step aside. When the shots rang out, both Mussolini and Petacci fell dead together. With them, fascism in Italy also died. If Mussolini's death had been swift, what followed was anything but dignified. The partisans loaded the bodies of Mussolini and Petacci and several other executed fascist leaders into a truck and drove them to Milan, the heart of northern Italy. There, on April 29, 1945, the corpses were dumped in the Piazzale Loreto, a public square that had symbolic importance. Only a year earlier, Mussolini's forces had displayed the bodies of executed resistance fighters in the same square, and now it was the dictator's turn. The bodies were strung up by their ankles from the roof of the petrol station. This shocking display allowed ordinary Italians to vent their anger. Crowds gathered to spit, shout, and throw stones at Mussolini's body. Some kicked it, others spat on it. A woman even fired a pistol into the corpses, saying it was revenge for the death of her husband. Photographs taken that day spread around the world, showing the once powerful dictator reduced to a battered and broken body, hanging upside down. Why was Mussolini's body treated with such violence? Well, the answer lies in the deep suffering that Italy had endured under his rule. Mussolini had led the country into a disastrous war, overseen brutal repression, and allowed Nazi Germany to occupy and ravage Italian towns and villages. Millions of Italians had suffered from hunger, bombings, and executions. For many, his public humiliation was not just vengeance, it was a symbolic cleansing, a final proof that the fascist era was over. The display also sent a political message. By showing Mussolini's corpse in such a degrading position, the partisans made clear that fascism had been defeated, not just militarily, but morally and spiritually. He was then buried after his remains were autopsied by the Americans. To begin with, he was buried inside an unmarked grave in a cemetery in the north of Milan, but it was no secret where his grave really was. And on the 21st of April 1946, the grave of Mussolini was broken into. and a young fascist and two of his friends removed the coffin and then began a huge operation to hide the remains. It took months for the body to be tracked down. But inside of the coffin there was a dark secret. One of the legs of the former dictator had been hacked off and stolen. Now the authorities then moved the body of Mussolini to a monastery for 11 years, and it was left there in secret. Even Mussolini's family had no idea where his remains were. In 1957, the remains were finally handed back to the Mussolini family, and his body, minus a leg, was placed inside of the tomb. The truth was that inside of the coffin there would have been little left of him. His body was badly beaten and battered by the crowd, but also decomposition and rot would have set in very quickly, meaning he was probably just a collection of bones. These were interred inside of a large stone sarcophagus, and the tomb is decorated in many symbols related to the fascist movement. The death of Benito Mussolini was one of the most dramatic and symbolic events of the Second World War. Captured whilst fleeing, executed by his own people, and then humiliated in front of the nation. Mussolini's end represented not just the collapse of his own power, but the destruction of the fascist dream that he had tried to build. His execution at Giuliano di Mezzagra and the public display in Milan turned Mussolini from Il Druce into a cautionary tale, a reminder of how quickly power can vanish and how brutally history can judge those who abuse it. By the early 1950s, Stalin was 74 years old and physically declining. Years of stress, heavy smoking and poor health had taken their toll. He suffered from high blood pressure and arteriosclerosis, a hardening of the arteries, which made him prone to strokes. Yet Stalin remained deeply suspicious of everyone around him. He trusted almost no one, not even his closest advisors. In fact, in his final months of life, he had begun yet another campaign of terror, the so-called Doctors' Plot, where many of the Soviet Union's top physicians, many of them Jewish, were accused of conspiring to assassinate Soviet leaders. These doctors were arrested and tortured. Ironically, this paranoia would play a role in how his own death unfolded. On the night of the 28th of February 1953, Stalin gathered a small circle of loyal aides and Communist Party officials at his Konteskvo dacha, a heavily guarded residence outside of Moscow. Among them were Lavrina Beria, the notorious head of the secret police, the senior figures like Gregory Malenkov, Nikita Khrushchevlev and Nikolai Boganin, and they spent the night drinking, eating and watching films, a habit Stalin enjoyed, and according to accounts, the party went late into the night, with the men leaving in the early hours of the 1st of March. Stalin appeared in good spirits when he dismissed them, but after they left, something went terribly wrong. Stalin retired to his private rooms and was not seen again until the following evening. Guards, who were terrified of disturbing him, hesitated when there was no movement or sound, and finally, at around 10:30 p.m. on the 1st of March, they gathered the courage to enter his room. There they found Stalin lying on the floor near his sofa, wearing his pyjamas. He was conscious but unable to speak and partially paralysed. He had suffered a massive stroke. On the table nearby were newspapers and notes, suggesting that he had collapsed suddenly. What followed was both tragic and telling of Stalin's reign of fear. For hours, no doctors were called. The guards and officials present, including Beria, were too frightened to act without a clear order. After all, Stalin had just accused doctors of plotting to kill Soviet leaders, so who would dare bring one into his presence now? Beria reportedly told the guards not to disturb Stalin and even mocked them for their concerns, saying that the leader was simply sleeping. Some historians believe Beria deliberately delayed medical attention, hoping Stalin would die and leave a power vacuum that he could exploit. It was not until the morning of the 2nd of March, more than 12 hours after Stalin had collapsed, that the doctors were finally summoned. And by then it was far too late. Stalin's condition was dire. He was unconscious, unable to speak, and his right side was paralysed. His breathing was laboured, and his pulse was weak. For the next 3 days, Stalin lingered between life and death. His daughter, Svetla Alienvia, who later defected to the West, recalled the scene vividly. She described the room filled with officials watching silently as Stalin struggled to breathe. His face was swollen and dark, and his breathing was heavy and rattling. Doctors tried various treatments, leeches to reduce blood pressure, injections, oxygen, but medicine could do little against such a massive stroke. Stalin drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally groaning or opening his eyes, but he never recovered. According to witnesses, his final moments were agonizing, and on the evening of the 5th of March 1953, his breathing grew more erratic. Suddenly he opened his eyes wide, his gaze sweeping the room, and those present felt like he looked at them with terror and anger, as though realizing betrayal surrounded him. Then he raised his hand, clenched it, and collapsed into an unconsciousness. Minutes later, at 9:50 p.m., Joseph Stalin was pronounced dead. Stalin's death shook the Soviet Union. To the public, he had been portrayed as an almost godlike figure, the father of the nation, the man who had led them to victory in the Great Patriotic War, and news of his passing spread across the USSR on the 6th of March, and millions wept openly. Crowds gathered in Moscow to see his coffin, and in the crush of mourners, several people were trampled to death. For the men who had surrounded him, however, Stalin's death was both an end and a beginning. Within hours, a scramble for power began. Beria initially seemed poised to take control, but within months he would be arrested and executed by rivals like Khrushchev. The dictatorship Stalin had built would slowly be dismantled in the years to come, especially after Khrushchev's famous secret speech in 1956 denouncing his crimes. Stalin had a huge funeral, and his coffin was placed on display in the Hall of Columns in the House of Unions, and it remained there for 3 days. It was then moved later to Lenin's mausoleum, and the body was placed on public display. Stalin's body specifically had been embalmed, and it had been washed by a nurse before its autopsy. It took 3 days for the embalming to take place, and when it came to place it inside of Lenin's mausoleum, there was a huge ceremony. Even though embalming had taken place, it was only prepared in this way for 3 days lying in state. It would have taken much more work to ensure this remained in the same way that Lenin's did. In November of 1953, 7 months after Stalin's death, Lenin's tomb was reopened, and Stalin was placed inside of the tomb in an open coffin, under glass near to Lenin's body. He was laying inside of this coffin and surrounded by flowers, and he wore one of his tunics. His signature moustache was still on his face, and his eyes were sealed shut as if he was sleeping. But following Stalin's death, Soviets began to realize that he had been responsible for the deaths of millions, and this began a process known as the de-Stalinization. This led to many to turn their backs on the former dictator and his policies, and with this there was a decision made to remove Stalin's body from the mausoleum. There was no ceremony for this, and then his body inside of the coffin was buried around 300 feet from the mausoleum, inside of a vault near to the other leaders of the revolution. The grave is close to the wall of the Kremlin, and it is obscured by trees, and today a dark granite stone marks the site of Stalin's grave and burial, along with a small bust of him. The death of Joseph Stalin was as dramatic as his rule. The man who had commanded armies, purged millions, and ruled through terror was reduced to lying helpless on the floor of his dacha, abandoned for hours by those who feared him too much to help. His final struggle, marked by paralysis, gasping breaths, and a deathbed glare, symbolized the contradictions of his reign: absolute power mixed with paranoia, and loyalty mixed with fear. Stalin had built a state where no one dared make a move without his approval, and in the end, the very system cost him his chance of survival. And on the 5th of March 1953, Joseph Stalin, one of the most ruthless dictators in history, finally met the one force that even he could not outmaneuver: death itself. Now, Ivan IV was born on the 25th of August 1530 in a small village near Moscow, the son of Vasily III, Grand Prince of Moscow. His early life was marked by tragedy and political intrigue, and Vasily III died in 1533 when Ivan was just 3 years old, leaving the state in the hands of his mother as regent. Elena's rule, however, was cut short when she died suddenly in 1538, possibly poisoned by a boyar, a noble, factions who sought to control the young heir, and after her death, Ivan and his younger brother Yuri were effectively orphans, subjected to neglect and mistreatment at the hands of the boyar families who vied for influence. Ivan would later recall in his letters that as a child he witnessed the boyars fighting and killing each other, while he and his brother were left hungry, dirty and humiliated. These early experiences fostered in Ivan a deep distrust and hatred of the boyar aristocracy, a resentment that would later define his rule. At the age of 16, in 1547, Ivan was crowned with the title the Tsar of all Rus, in a ceremony that emphasized his divine right to rule. This was a pivotal moment in Russian history, as the title of Tsar, derived from Caesar, suggested imperial ambitions and spiritual authority akin to that of the Byzantine emperors. The early years of Ivan's reign were surprisingly progressive and marked by a desire to reform and strengthen the Russian state. Guided by capable advisors, particularly a group known as the Chosen Council, Ivan enacted a series of reforms designed to modernize and centralize power. In 1549, he convened the Zemsky Soba, Russia's first national assembly, bringing together representatives of various social classes to discuss governance. He introduced a new legal code, the Sudbink of 1550, which was aimed to standardise justice and curb the arbitrary power of the boyars. Ivan also reorganised the military, creating the Stelsky, a corps of professional musketeers, and expanded the system of local self-government. One of his most enduring accomplishments was the conquest and expansion of Russian territory. In 1552, Ivan launched a successful campaign against the Khanty of Kazan, a Tatar state that had long threatened Russia's eastern borders. The victory was celebrated with the construction of St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow, a masterpiece of Russian architecture. In 1556, he captured the Kazanty of Askatan, gaining control of the lower Vogel River and opening trade routes to the Caspian Sea. These victories cemented Ivan's reputation as a formidable ruler and expanded Russia into the multi-ethnic empire. However, Ivan's fortunes began to decline during the protracted Livian War from 1558 to 1583. His goal was to gain access to the Baltic Sea by seizing territories from the weakened Livonian Order, but the war dragged on for decades. It involved Sweden, Poland, Lithuania and Denmark. The conflict drained the Russian economy, devastated much of the countryside and resulted in eventual defeat. Russia not only failed to secure the Baltic, but then also lost valuable western territories. It was during this period that Ivan's chapter began to darken. In 1560, the death of his beloved first wife, Anastasia Romanova, deeply affected him. Ivan suspected that she had been poisoned by boyars, further fueling his paranoia and hatred of the nobility. This personal tragedy marked the beginning of his transformation from a reformist ruler into a tyrant. In 1565, Ivan introduced the infamous Opshchina, a policy that divided Russia into two parts. The Opshching, directly controlled by Ivan, and the Zemshing, administered by traditional boyar institutions. Ivan created a personal guard, the Oprinsky, who dressed in black, carried dog heads and brooms as symbols of ferocity and purification, and were tasked with rooting out treason and opposition. The Oprinching unleashed a new reign of terror. Whole towns were destroyed, thousands were tortured and exiled or executed, and the boyar class was decimated. One of the most notorious episodes was the massacre of Novgorod in 1570, when Ivan suspected the city of treason and ordered the Aprenchki to carry out mass killings, looting and torture, resulting in thousands of deaths. While the Aprenching temporarily strengthened Ivan's autocratic control, it also severely weakened Russia's economy and military. Trade declined, agricultural land was devastated, and the general population suffered enormously from famine and oppression. Ivan's later years were marked by instability and personal tragedy. His temper and paranoia extended to his own family. In 1581, during a violent argument, Ivan struck his eldest son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, with his staff, fatally wounding him. This event not only devastated Ivan personally, but also left Russia without a strong successor, as his surviving son, Fyodor, was mentally weak and ill-prepared to rule. And by the early 1580s, Ivan was physically and mentally deteriorating. His health declined and his erratic behaviour became more pronounced. Despite his violent tendencies, Ivan was a deeply religious man, spending hours in prayer and confessing his sins even as he continued to commit atrocities. On the 28th of March 1584, whilst he was playing chess, Ivan the Terrible had a stroke and he died relatively instantly. He was buried inside of a Moscow cathedral and was later laid to rest inside of a large stone tomb which carries many inscriptions. But in 1963, almost 400 years after his death, the tomb of Ivan and his sons was opened for the first time, and the graves were disturbed. And what was found inside the tomb was the heavily decomposed remains of Ivan, and there was no skin that existed on the remains, only bones. His teeth were relatively in good condition, and there was also a lot of debris and dirt inside of the tomb covering the remains. This could have been the remains of clothes that he was buried in. The body was analysed and used. This was discovered that despite suggestions at the time that Ivan suffered from syphilis, this wasn't the case, and it was also discovered that he was not poisoned using arsenic and that he had not been strangled to death. The analysis also showed that when he died he was around 5'10" tall and he weighed around 90 kilograms. It was also found that he had a lot of bone spurs or lumps which formed around his joints, meaning he had arthritis and suffered with his joints. These were said to have been uncharacteristic with his age, meaning that his lifestyle may have caused him to have joint issues. He may have been heavier too, and it was concluded that Ivan the Terrible may have struggled to move in his final years, but he also had an excessive concentration of mercury in his remains. This could have been part of a treatment or ointment which was applied to his joints to try and help heal them. Now, Ivan IV, the Terrible, remains one of the most fascinating figures in history, a ruler of extraordinary intelligence, ambition and willpower, yet also plagued by paranoia, brutality and personal demons. His life story is a study in contrasts, a child neglected by the nobility, who grew to distrust and destroy them, a ruler who began as a reformer but became a despot, a man who sought to unite and expand Russia but also left it fractured and weakened. Ultimately, Ivan's reign laid both the foundations for the empire and the seeds of the future turmoil. His legacy is a testament to the dangers of unchecked power and the enduring complexities of leadership in a land as vast and turbulent as Russia. One of the most crazy executions in English history saw the King, Charles I, on the 30th of January 1649, be taken to the executioner's scaffold, which had been created on Whitehall. He was the man who had plunged his country into the deadliest civil war ever fought on English soil, and he has been condemned by Parliament and figures such as Oliver Cromwell. But the king was met by an anonymous executioner and an axeman who in one swing of the axe took the king's head from his shoulders. However, as the king's remains were gathered up, there was a question as to what to do with the body of Charles I, as Parliament were worried that it would become a royalist relic and be venerated by those who wanted to oppose the new political structure in England. But Charles I was buried in secret, alongside one of the most controversial and notorious kings of England, Henry VIII. But 200 years after his execution, his coffin was broken into. King Charles I's execution was a shocking event in which he was taken under armed escort to the Palace of Whitehall, next to where he would be executed. He was escorted onto the scaffold, and his public were looking on, and he was taken through a window of the banqueting house. Charles made a speech to the crowd that day which was difficult to hear, and he said, "An unjust sentence that I suffered to take effect is punished now by an unjust sentence on me. But I must tell you that their liberty and freedom consists in having government. It is not their having a share in the government. That is nothing appertaining unto them. A subject and a sovereign are clean different things. Before finishing, I shall go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown, where no disturbance can be." His words were ominous, and were those of a man who believed his time on earth was up, but Charles would then be given himself over to the executioner at around 2 p.m. He then lowered himself onto the block after uttering a prayer, and he told the executioner he was ready by stretching his arms out as the blow from the axe then came crashing down. The king lost his head, and the crowd that day sighed, as they were not necessarily excited with what they saw. Many believed that Charles I was sent by God to rule over them, and that now they would be punished. The executioner did show the king's head to the crowd, but his remains were then gathered together and were placed in a coffin ready for burial. After the execution, the remains of Charles were then embalmed, and during this the royal physicians and doctors sewed the head of the Stuart monarch back on. But there was much debate as to where to bury the lead-lined coffin and the body of the executed king. Parliament began to debate this, and they believed it was too much of a risk to bury the king inside of central London, where it could be dug up, and they did not want to allow Charles the precedent of being buried alongside other kings and queens in Westminster Abbey. Parliament feared retribution and revenge for what they had done to Charles, and they did not want his burial site to become a shrine, but they then came to the conclusion to bury Charles inside of Windsor Castle, and specifically St George's Chapel, but this would be done in secret. It was said that this was a quieter place to bury the king, but the royal vaults would become much busier in the centuries after. In the middle of the night, on the 9th of February 1649, the coffin of Charles I was taken quietly from central London to Windsor, and he was then buried inside of the same vault as King Henry VIII, who was also laid to rest in a purpose-built vault alongside his third wife, Jane Seymour. This was said to have been a rather secretive space. There were plans for Charles II, the executed king's son, to bury his father in a grand mausoleum inside of Hyde Park, but this never occurred, and still today Charles is laid to rest in this vault with Henry VIII, two brutal kings laying side by side. However, for centuries it was believed that Charles's coffin had been lost to time, and thus his remains were missing. But the burial vault containing his body was actually broken into during building work in 1813, and the builders also found the remains of a child's coffin, this being the child of Queen Anne that tragically died. But Henry VIII's coffin was said to have been in a very poor state, as it had been broken, and there were even stories of people breaking into his coffin and stealing his bones. But Charles's coffin was found next to Henry, and the man who was investigating this was Sir Henry Halford, and he opened Charles's coffin on the 1st of April 1813 to confirm that this was in fact the lost body of the executed Stuart monarch. He did this in front of the Prince Regent, the future George IV, but he noticed when he broke into the coffin that Charles's head, which had come loose from his body. As mentioned, his head was sewn back on, but the thread must have decayed in the years since. On top of the coffin was an inscription that said King Charles 1649, and it was noted that the body of Charles I had been prepared in a different way. It was wrapped in a number of layers of cerecloth, which helped preserve it well, and it was so well wrapped that Halford had to take the body out of the coffin to unwrap it. He then wrote that at length the whole face was disengaged from its covering. The complexion of the skin of it was dark and discoloured. The forehead and temples had lost little or nothing of their muscular substance. The cartilage of the nose was gone, but the left eye, in the first moment of exposure, was open and full, though it vanished almost immediately. And the pointed beard, so characteristic of the period of the reign of King Charles, was perfect. The shape of the face was a long oval. Many of the teeth remained, and the left ear, in consequence of the interposition of the untouched matter between it and cerecloth, was found entire. It was difficult at this moment to withhold a declaration that, notwithstanding its disfigurement, the countenance did bear a strong resemblance to the coins, the busts, and especially to the pictures of King Charles I by Van Dyck, by which it had been made familiar to us. It's true that the minds of the spectators of this interesting sight were well prepared to receive this impression, but it is also certain that such a facility of belief had been occasioned by the simplicity and truth of Mr. Herbert's narrative, every part of which had been confirmed by the investigation so far as it had advanced, and it will not be denied that the shape of the face, the forehead and eye, the beard, and the most important features by which resemblance is determined. When the head had been entirely disengaged from the attachments which confined it, it was found to be loose, and without any difficulty was taken up and held to view. It was quite wet, and gave a greenish-red tinge to paper and to linen when touched it. The back part of the scalp was entirely perfect, and had a remarkably fresh appearance, the pores of the skin being more distinct, as they usually are when soaked in moisture, and the tendons and ligaments of the neck were of considerable substance and firmness. The hair was thick at the back part of the head, and in appearance nearly black. A portion of it, which has since been cleaned and dried, is of a beautiful dark brown colour. That of the beard was a redder brown. On the back part of the head it was more than an inch in length, and had probably been cut so short for the convenience of the executioner, or perhaps by the piety of friends soon after death, in order to furnish memorials of the unhappy king. This was a huge achievement for Sir Henry Halford. He had found the remains of the executed King of England, and he even held up the head and confirmed it was Charles without any doubt. He said that the muscles of the neck had evidently retracted themselves considerably, and the fourth cervical vertebra was found to be cut through its substance transversely, leaving the surface of the divided portions perfectly smooth, and even an appearance which could have been produced by a heavy blow inflicted with a very sharp instrument. This added further evidence that it was the king, as it confirmed that he had lost his head by a sharp weapon, such as an axe. But after it was said, following the examination of the head, which served every purpose in view, and without examining the body below the neck, it was immediately restored to its situation. The coffin was soldered up again, and the vault closed. This was the last time that the vault of the King Charles I, and also Henry VIII, was opened at all, and Charles was a man who led his nation into civil war, and some believed it was justified what happened to him on that cold January morning on the scaffold in 1649. But in the years after, his remains were unwrapped, and his coffin was broken into in front of a crowd of shocked onlookers, including the future king. One of the key witnesses to the final moments of King Louis XVI was his confessor, a priest who remained with him on his final day. He said about the king as he made his way to the guillotine that The path leading to the scaffold was extremely rough and difficult to pass. The king was obliged to lean on my arm, and from the slowness with which he proceeded, I feared for a moment that his courage might fail. But what was my astonishment, when arrived at the last step, I felt that he suddenly let go of my arm, and I saw him cross with a firm foot the breadth of the whole scaffold. Silence, by his look alone, 15 or 20 drums that were placed opposite to me, and in a voice so loud that it must have been heard at the Pointe Tournante, I heard him pronounce distinctly these memorable words: "I die innocent of all the crimes laid to my charge. I pardon those who have occasioned my death, and I pray to God that the blood you are going to shed may never be visited on France." On the scaffold he was approached by the executioner and his assistant, and there were roughly 80,000 guards surrounding the execution structure to ensure there would be no trouble. The Place de la Révolution in Paris was packed with people, was heavily crowded, and Louis XVI wanted to address the crowd, but he was deterred from doing this. He shouted out that, "Gentlemen, I am innocent of everything of which I am accused. I hope that my blood may cement the good fortune of the French." He was then strapped hurriedly onto the tilting board, and his neck was placed under the slanted blade of the guillotine. The executioner then released the blade, which fell with speed, and there has been some debate that the execution did not go well because of the rush of it. Some have claimed that instead of going through his neck, that the blade fell through the king's chin, shattering it on the way down, but nevertheless the king's head was taken clean off. His head was then displayed to the crowd, and one contemporary painting shows the king's head fastened to a pole, and the executioner thrust it high in the air to show everyone. Some guards even tried to dip their handkerchiefs in the king's blood as a souvenir. But then the required next step was to bury the king. His body and his head were placed on the back of a cart, and this was then driven off towards the old church of the Madeleine, a place where many enemies of the Revolution had been buried following their execution. The point of this was to make no special arrangements for King Louis XVI's death and body, but to bury him as a common criminal in the eyes of the revolutionaries. A short funeral service and memorial did take place inside of the church, and 2 priests who had sworn their utmost loyalty to the revolution were allowed to perform this short ceremony. Inside the graveyard there was a grave which had been dug by a group of grave diggers. This was not the deepest grave, and inside of it there was a bed of quicklime placed, aimed to quickly reduce Louis XVI's remains to virtually nothing. One of the priests who oversaw the burial said that, "I called for silence. A detachment of the gendarmes showed us the body. It was clothed in a white vest and grey silk breeches with matching stockings. We chanted vespers and the service for the dead. In pursuance of an executive order, the body lying in its open coffin was thrown onto a bed of quicklime at the bottom of the pit and covered by one of earth, the whole being firmly and thoroughly tamped down. Louis XVI's head was placed at his feet. After Louis's coffin was placed in the grave, further quicklime was then thrown on his remains, and the point of this was to make sure they decayed quicker and to make them disappear. It was intended for the king's burial place to remain secret, but this never worked, as it was very much well known where Louis XVI had been buried. There would be people who later even visited and paid their respects, and Louis had been buried in his shirt, waistcoat, breeches and stockings, and was interred roughly 10 feet from the wall of the cemetery, and the grave was not deep enough, and it was not 12 feet deep, which was required, and the grave was somewhat shallow. One of the grave diggers would later say that, when they arrived, I was still in the pit. I got out quickly and set to work with my spade on that pile of quicklime over there, where you can still see the traces. There were 5 bags of lime pellets. I mixed the lime into a paste and, with the help of another man, poured water on it so that it started to boil. The wooden coffins were there on the side, the great basket next to it. I pulled the body from the basket. I wanted to untie his hands, which were bound behind his back, but the deputies absolutely refused to let me, so I put him in just as he was, fully dressed, into his coffin. They hadn't cut off a single hair. His hair was curled and still attached with a comb, which is buried down there as well. I laid him out in his wooden coffin. He later also said he was missing only his shoes. He had a slightly dirty white waistcoat, his shirt of course grey breeches and silk stockings. Afterwards I picked up his head, which I placed on his neck. His eyes were open, and then we lowered him onto the bed of bubbling quicklime. The priests came forwards and said prayers, and then we put the lid on the coffin and added water and more lime pellets on top and sides. Finally there was the earth which you see. But it would not be long before there was a need to dig up the French king, and restoration of the monarchy called for this on the 18th of January 1815. The digging inside of the graveyard began, and the purpose of this was to give King Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette somewhat of a decent burial, and they were to then be interred inside of the Basilica of St. Denis and the royal mausoleum containing the remains of many Bourbon rulers. The former gravediggers who had buried Louis were brought back to help if they were still alive, and inside of the Madeleine cemetery the ground was broken. Marie Antoinette, the queen of Louis XVI, was found first on the first day, and her remains were discovered easily, and even her stockings were found, and some of her hair was allegedly still on her skull. But the discovery of King Louis XVI's remains came the following day. A deep trench was dug near to the wall, and the workers discovered several pieces of coffin, and they then found the skeleton of a man who had lost his head and who had wounds on his skull. The head had also been placed between the legs in the coffin, as Louis XVI had, and there was no clothing found. Now what had happened was that the quicklime added to the body had very much done its job, and partially dissolved the remains of the king, and his remains were heavily damaged by this, and were in such a bad state of decay. There was further searches in the region to search for other bodies, and it was generally accepted that the remains of King Louis XVI had been found, and that these were those of the king. It was said of the exhumation that, a deep trench nearer the wall being opened in our presence, we discovered some earth mingled with lime, and several small pieces of board indicated a coffin. The search was then carried out with the greatest care, but instead a bed of pure lime, as round the Queen's coffin, we found that the earth and lime had been mixed, but that there was a greater proportion of the latter substance. In the mixture of earth and lime we discovered the bones of a man, several of which were on the point of crumbling to dust. The skull was covered with lime and placed between the leg bones. Fragments of clothes were carefully looked for, but none were discovered. We collected all the remains and placed them together with some pieces of lime in a cloth brought for the purpose. Although the spot in which the body was found corresponded with that pointed out by the several eyewitnesses of the interment, and the situation of the head left no doubt to its identity, we nevertheless caused the group to be dug 12 deep feet to the distance of 25 feet in order to ascertain whether there was anywhere a bed of pure lime. No such bed being found was a corroboration of the proof, already satisfactory, that the remains we were in possession of were those of the king. The remains we then placed in a chest, which were then sealed with the arms of France, conveyed into the hall of M. Delaclos, and placed by the side of those of the queen. The priest continued to repeat the prayers of the church over the two bodies. As mentioned, the bodies of the king and queen were exhumed to give them a proper burial amongst the kings and queens of France inside the Basilica of St. Denis. A large funeral procession took place, where they were then laid to rest inside of a tomb, along with many other kings and queens. Their remains, surprisingly, had escaped being thrown into a river or being dumped into a pit during the Reign of Terror, and also in the subsequent years of the French Revolution, and many kings and queens had their bodies desecrated. It was said of their funeral that the princes and princesses, followed by the Grand Master and Master of the Ceremonies, and their assistant, approached the altar to present their offerings, after which a funeral oration was delivered by the Bishop of Troyes. The absolution having been pronounced, the bodies were lowered into the royal vault, into which Monsieur and two priests, his sons, descended and prostrated themselves upon the coffins of their royal relatives. Salutes of artillery were fired at the moment when the procession set out from Paris, during the service at St Denis, and when the bodies were lowered into the vault. Still today, the remains of King Louis XVI and his Queen Marie Antoinette are buried in a tomb inside the royal vault inside the Basilica of St Denis. The exhumation of Louis XVI discovered the partial remains of a king who was very much regarded as an enemy of the people, and his execution wasn't just aimed to bring about the death of a specific king, but the intention was to bring about the complete end and desecration of the idea of the monarchy across France. Thank you for watching, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. And again, thank you so much for watching.